In 536, medieval Europe vanished into fog for a year and a half. The sun barely broke through, even at midday. Harvard historians call it one of the worst years in the history of the human race, if not the single worst outright. To this day, nobody can say for certain which volcano on the other side of the world caused it, and it was only the opening blow. Cold and famine came first. Then came a plague that emptied entire cities. Today, 10 medieval disasters that came within inches of ending civilization itself. What caused them, and which one killed more people than any war in history? Number 10. The Antioch earthquake. Antioch was one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. It stood alongside Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria as one of the 4 great capitals of the Eastern Mediterranean, a center of trade, learning, and early Christian worship that had thrived for centuries before that spring morning. Hundreds of thousands of people lived within its walls, and that particular week, the city was even fuller than usual. Pilgrims had poured in from across the region. It was the 29th of May, 526. Antioch was celebrating the Feast of the Ascension. Church squares were packed. Markets were packed. Every guest house in the city was full, and every road leading in was crowded with travelers who had come to worship. Then the ground did not simply shake. It convulsed. Survivors later described the earth moving in waves, as if the solid stone streets had turned into water beneath their feet. Buildings that had stood for centuries came down within seconds. Colonnaded avenues that pilgrims had walked just minutes earlier collapsed into rubble before anyone had time to run. Entire families were buried where they stood, mid-conversation, mid-prayer, mid-meal. There was no gap between calm and catastrophe. One moment the city was singing hymns for the Ascension. The next moment, in less time than it takes to read this sentence out loud, columns snapped, roofs caved inward, and the streets themselves cracked open beneath the crowd. Dust rose so thick over the city that people miles away thought Antioch had simply vanished into a cloud. Aftershocks kept rattling the ruins for days afterward, collapsing walls that the first shock had only weakened and sending survivors, who were digging for the missing, scrambling back into the open streets. Chroniclers who lived through it, men like John Samalas, wrote that somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 people died on that single day. Modern historians think that count runs too high. Writers in the ancient world often rounded numbers upward to capture pure horror rather than to produce a precise census. Even so, the most careful modern estimates still place this among the deadliest single earthquakes ever recorded on Earth, ancient or modern. Antioch before that morning was one of the most densely populated cities anywhere in the late Roman world, which is exactly why even a heavily discounted death toll still lands among the worst single-day losses of life ever recorded. And the shaking was only the opening act. Within hours, fires broke out across the wreckage of the city, sparked by cooking flames and broken oil lamps buried under collapsed roofs. This time, fire finished what the ground had started. The flames burned for days, moving street by street through neighborhoods that had already been flattened. Thick black smoke hung over the ruins so long that it blotted out the sun for anyone still trying to dig survivors out from under the stone. The fire reached the great church, known across the empire as the Domus Aurea, one of the most magnificent buildings in the entire Christian world, and reduced it to ash along with the homes, shops, and shrines that had surrounded it for generations. Picture a city about the size of modern-day Pittsburgh, losing that many people in the time it takes to walk from one end of a public park to the other. Then picture everything that had somehow survived the shaking simply burning to the ground a few days later, while exhausted survivors dug through hot rubble with their bare hands, searching for anyone still breathing, calling out names into the smoke, and rarely getting an answer back. Some kept digging long after any reasonable hope was gone, because stopping meant accepting what the silence already told them. One person who lived through that week wrote something that has survived 15 centuries of copying and translation. He called it the fifth disaster sent down by the wrath of God, ranking it among the worst catastrophes anyone in his lifetime had witnessed. He was not exaggerating for effect. He had just watched the fourth largest city in the Roman world reduced to smoking rubble in a single afternoon, its churches, its markets, its family homes, all gone before anyone could even begin to count the dead. Even measured against modern disasters, with modern warning systems and modern rescue equipment, very few single days in recorded history have claimed that many lives in one place. But Antioch, as horrifying as it was, went down fast, and it went down in one place. The ground struck violently, the fire finished the job within a matter of days, and by the following week the disaster itself was essentially over, leaving only the burying and the rebuilding. One city, one catastrophe, one location on the map, and the rest of the empire went on largely untouched. The next catastrophe on our list did something almost worse. It did not strike in minutes and vanish. It came from the sea itself, and it came for an entire coastline at once, swallowing farmland, churches, and one thriving trading town so completely that for over 600 years, nobody on Earth could even prove that town had ever existed at all. Number 9. The Great Drowning. On the night of January 16, 1362, the North Sea did not simply rise, it attacked. A massive winter storm, powered by extreme low pressure, collided with a spring tide, the kind of tide that already pushes seawater higher than normal even on a calm day. Both forces slammed into the coastline of the North Sea at exactly the same moment in the middle of the night, while entire villages were asleep. The storm carried a second name too, St. Marcellus's flood. After the saint's feast day, it struck on the medieval calendar, and chroniclers across 4 separate regions independently described the exact same terror: water that kept climbing long after everyone expected it to stop. The people living along the coasts of Britain, the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark had no warning system and no time to run inland. There was no way to see the storm coming in the dark, no way to know that the sea level rising outside their windows would not stop rising. The water simply came up and over the top of the earthen dikes built to protect them, and once it started coming, it did not stop. This was not one town flooding while its neighbors sent help. This was hundreds of miles of coastline, across 4 different regions, drowning at the exact same hour. Every village that might have rowed out to rescue the next one over was fighting for its own life at the very same moment. There was nowhere for anyone to run to, because the disaster had no edges that night. By morning, at least 25,000 people were dead. Some historians believe the true number reached 100,000 across the whole region. That is roughly the population of an entire modern college town, gone before sunrise. 44 villages were gone. Not damaged, not partly flooded, gone, wiped completely off the map in a single night. Their fields, their livestock, and their harvest stores all turned into open sea within hours. Grain stores meant to feed entire villages through the coming winter dissolved into salt water within minutes, leaving even survivors who reached higher ground facing hunger long after the tide finally pulled back. One of those villages was a thriving trading town called Rungholt, on the island of Strand. According to local memory before that night, it held as many as 500 houses and roughly 3,000 residents, a real working town with churches, with busy markets, with merchants counting the coins earned that day, with families who went to sleep expecting to wake up in their own beds the next morning, just like any other night. None of them did. By the time the water finally pulled back days later, there was no rubble left to search through, the way there had been in Antioch. There was simply open water where a town used to be. No walls to dig through, no foundations to mark where a home had stood. The sea had not just killed the people of Rungholt, it had erased the physical evidence that they had ever lived there at all. Here is the detail that makes this disaster different from almost anything else on this list. The dikes meant to hold back the sea were already falling apart long before the storm ever arrived. Just over a decade earlier, the Black Death had swept through the region and killed so many laborers that there was simply nobody left to repair the seawalls properly. Communities that once had entire crews of workers patching the earthen banks every spring were reduced to a handful of exhausted survivors, and the sea does not wait politely for a region to finish burying its dead before testing its defenses again. The plague itself did not drown Rungholt. It just made sure nobody remained to stop the water once it finally came looking for a way in. Fields that had once been drained and defended by entire teams of laborers, generation after generation, were left to the mercy of the tide, because there was simply nobody left alive with the strength to maintain them properly. For centuries afterward, Rungholt became something close to a local legend, a lost town people whispered about but could never quite locate on any map. Some dismissed it as a folk tale, a myth stitched together from grief. Ruins were finally uncovered beneath the coastal mud in 1921, yet nobody could prove for certain they truly belonged to Rungholt itself. It took until 2023, using modern geophysical scanning equipment developed for a completely different kind of research, for German researchers to finally confirm it beyond doubt. A town erased from existence in a single night took 661 years for science to fully believe it had ever existed at all. But the sea, as merciless as it was that night, can only destroy what it can physically reach. The next disaster on our list did not need water at all. It came from a volcano in Iceland that erupted for months on end without stopping, and its ash cooled the entire planet so severely that it triggered famine along the Nile in far-off Egypt and froze rivers solid in China, all from one remote island that most Europeans of the time could not even find on a map. Number 8. The Eldgja Eruption. Picture a crack in the earth stretching for over 40 kilometers, splitting open in the middle of Iceland, pouring out more lava than any eruption the island had ever produced before or since. No city stood there. No army marched through it. Just empty highland, tearing itself open for more than a year. Iceland at the time held only a scattering of farming settlements, a population that could be counted in the thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands, which meant this eruption did almost all of its damage far from the eyes of the people. It would eventually hurt the most. In the spring of 939, the ground along the Eldgja fissure gave way. Lava did not come out in one single blast. It surged out in pulses, again and again, easing off and then returning, all the way into the autumn of 940. When it finally went quiet, Eldgja had produced the largest fissure eruption ever recorded in Iceland's entire history, a title it still holds. Volcanologists studying the fissure today still rank it among the largest sulfur-releasing eruptions of the entire medieval world. A single event capable of loading the upper atmosphere with more reflective haze than almost anything else that happened in the centuries around it. The lava itself stayed local, buried under Iceland's own black rock. The smoke did not stay anywhere. Sulfur and ash climbed high into the upper atmosphere and spread across the whole northern half of the planet, riding the winds far past anywhere the eruption itself could ever reach. Tree rings tell the story better than any chronicle could. Trees from Alaska to Canada, from Central Asia to Scandinavia, all recorded the exact same signal in their growth rings for that year. The summer of 940 came in cold, in some places 1.5 degrees colder than normal, cold enough to stunt a season's growth on 3 separate continents at once. Scientists read those growth rings the same way a detective reads a fingerprint, a single unusually narrow ring marking a summer that never properly warmed up, showing up in trees that never knew each other existed, growing on opposite sides of the planet. That number sounds small until you follow where the cold actually traveled. Thousands of kilometers south in Egypt, the volcanic haze in the atmosphere weakened the seasonal monsoon rains that feed the Nile River. Egypt's entire food supply depended on one thing: the Nile flooding its banks every year and leaving behind rich soil for planting. In 939, that flood came in low. Farmers who had done everything right still watched their harvest fail because a mountain they had never heard of, on an island they had never heard of, had quietly starved their river. Egypt's granaries, which the whole eastern Mediterranean depended on, sat that year thinner than farmers could remember, and nobody along the Nile had any idea why. In the years that followed, on the completely opposite side of the world, chroniclers in China were writing about winters so brutal that canals and even open stretches of sea froze solid enough to walk across. Europe went through its own miserable stretch of harsh winters and failed, dry summers, running from 939 all the way through 942. Rivers that had never frozen solid within living memory suddenly bore the weight of a loaded cart, and farmers who had never once worried about their wells icing over now watched water freeze inside barrels stored indoors. One eruption, one narrow crack in an empty Icelandic wilderness. It had somehow reached Egypt, China, and half of Europe, all within the same handful of terrible years. Some historians push the connection even closer to home. Iceland's own small population lived directly through the ash fall and the ruined harvests that followed the eruption. And several researchers now argue that this exact climate shock helped push the island toward abandoning its old gods and converting to Christianity within the following 2 generations. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. A volcano most people alive today have never even heard of, erupting on a nearly empty island in the middle of the North Atlantic, managed to starve farmers along the Nile and freeze rivers in China in the very same terrible stretch of months. And for over 1,000 years, nobody connected any of it. Scientists only pieced the full picture together recently, cross-matching ice cores and tree rings against North African writings that were unearthed and translated in the 2020s. Nobody living through 940 had the faintest idea that a fissure ripped open in Iceland was the reason their world had gone cold, dry, and hungry, all at exactly the same time. But Eldgja's damage crept in slowly, season by season, ocean by ocean, giving people scattered across 3 continents at least some time to notice the failing harvests and try to adjust. The next disaster on this list gave no such warning at all. It arrived in a single night, with no ash cloud to blame and no years of buildup to see coming, and by morning, a wealthy medieval city was reduced to ash and rubble. Number 7. The Basel earthquake. Picture a prosperous walled city at dusk, bells ringing for evening prayer, market stalls just closing up for the night. Nobody inside those walls has any reason to think the ground itself is about to turn against them. Earthquakes are not supposed to happen here. Basel, by the middle of the 1300s, had grown into one of the most important trading and banking centers anywhere along the Rhine. A walled city dense with stone churches, guild halls, and a hilltop castle that had watched over the valley for generations, without ever once being tested by the ground itself. On the 18th of October, 1356, the city of Basel, in what is now Switzerland, was struck by the strongest earthquake ever documented anywhere in Central Europe. Modern seismologists, reconstructing the event centuries later from damaged records and building collapse patterns, place its magnitude somewhere between 6.7 and 7.1, strong enough to level a modern downtown, let alone a city built entirely from stone and timber. For comparison, that magnitude range sits close to some of the most destructive earthquakes recorded anywhere in the 20th century. Only this one struck a medieval city with no reinforced concrete, no steel framing, and no seismic engineering of any kind standing between its people and the shaking. A smaller foreshock rattled the city first, sometime around 7 in the evening. People ran outside into the streets, frightened but alive, watching their homes for signs of more damage. Many decided the worst had passed and went back inside to wait it out. Then, close to 10 at night, the real one hit. Stone castles, parish churches, and long stretches of the city walls came down within moments. Survivors who had gone back indoors after that first tremor were buried under the very buildings they had trusted their whole lives to protect them. Near the center of the shaking, the intensity was strong enough to flatten nearly everything still standing, stone walls included. Cracks tore straight through the thick stone walls of Basel's own cathedral, a building that had already stood for generations, and that everyone in the city regarded as close to indestructible. The bishop's own castle, built specifically to withstand siege and assault, fared no better against a threat that came from underground instead of from over the walls. Then came the part that turned a bad earthquake into a citywide catastrophe. The collapsing buildings knocked over hearths, oil lamps, and open cooking flames throughout the city, and Basel's tightly packed wooden roofs caught fire, one after another, house by house. Within a single hour, dozens of separate fires that had started independently across different neighborhoods began merging into one continuous wall of flame, moving through streets that had been narrow and tightly packed even before they filled with fallen stone. With the streets already choked by rubble and broken stone, there was no way to fight the flames properly, and no clear way to escape them either. The fire burned through the rest of the night, patiently finishing off a city center the earthquake had already broken wide open. By morning, one of the wealthiest trading cities in the entire region was largely reduced to ash and broken stone, its walls, its churches, and its castle all gone within a single night. The shaking itself did not stay anywhere near Basel. Tremors were reportedly felt as far away as Paris to the west and Prague to the east, a spread of many hundreds of kilometers radiating out from one single fault line, deep under a region that nobody at the time believed could ever shake like that. Letters and chronicle entries from towns along the way describe church bells ringing on their own as the ground trembled beneath them, hundreds of kilometers from Basel itself, proof of just how far a single fault line could reach on that one night. Here is the detail worth sitting with. Central Europe has never been considered a high-risk earthquake zone, not in the 1300s and not today. This is simply not ground that produces earthquakes of this size. And yet, 650 years later, no earthquake anywhere in Central Europe has ever matched what happened to Basel on that one October night. One city, sitting in a region normally thought of as geologically calm and safe, still quietly holds a grim record that it never asked for, and that nobody has come close to breaking since. Basel had no warning system, no building codes for shaking ground, nothing but stone walls built to stop invading armies, never designed to survive the earth itself moving beneath them. But Basel's disaster, as brutal as it was, at least came and went in a single night of shaking and fire, over almost as soon as it began. The next entry on this list did not need the ground to move at all. It needed only one sick person, a crowded city, and a matter of months, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it may have quietly killed 9 out of every 10 people who lived there. Number 6. The Hebei Outbreak. Picture a Chinese province gone eerily quiet. Fields left half-harvested, gates standing open, carts abandoned on the road, and no one left to close the gates or claim the carts. In 1331, in the Yuan Empire, an epidemic tore through the province of Hebei in northern China, one of the most populous and productive regions under Mongol rule. Physicians of the time described bodies breaking out in dark swellings and fevers that killed within days of the first symptom. Entire villages simply stopped answering on the tax rolls because there was no one left to answer for them. Officials sent to collect grain and count households found empty houses instead, doors still open, meals left half-eaten on the table. By 1333, the outbreaks that began here and spread into neighboring provinces had killed as many as 13 million people, according to old chronicled death tolls that modern historians treat as rough and likely inflated. To put that in perspective, that is close to the entire population of a modern mid-sized country, gone in the span of a few harvest cycles, in a corner of the world most history classes never even mention. Neighboring provinces watched refugees stream past their borders long before the sickness itself arrived, families carrying what little they could on their backs, looking for anywhere the fields were still being worked and the granaries were still full. By the time officials in the capital understood the scale of what was happening in Hebei, the epidemic had already moved on to the provinces those refugees had fled toward. Some contemporary accounts claim up to 90% of the population in the hardest-hit districts of Hebei was gone by the time these waves of sickness finally passed. Historians treat that figure with real caution. Record-keeping in this period was uneven, and grief has a way of inflating numbers passed down through generations. But even the most careful, conservative readings still describe a province brought completely to its knees, its fields going wild, its towns shrinking to a fraction of their former size within a single generation. A historian named Robert Himes, working at Columbia University, went digging through 13th-century Chinese medical texts and found something chilling. Precise descriptions of swollen lymph nodes, the exact symptom doctors would later recognize as the calling card of plague, written down by physicians who had no name yet for what they were watching spread. He connected the outbreak to the chaos left behind by the Mongol conquests that had swept through northern China a century earlier. Armies and trade routes carrying far more than soldiers and silk across the continent. Here is where the story turns strange. Modern genetic research has traced the ancestry of the very bacterium behind the Black Death to the mountains near the Tian Shan Range, close to those same Mongol trade routes, and close to this same window of time. The pathogen that would later empty out European cities may have been quietly stirring in the highlands of Central Asia, while Hebei was already burying its dead. Whether Hebei was truly the opening scene of that much larger catastrophe is still debated among scientists today. The genetic trail and the historical trail run close together, close enough to raise eyebrows, but they do not lock into place with total certainty, and honest researchers say so plainly rather than force the connection. What is not in doubt is the scale of the suffering itself. A single Chinese province lost up to 9 out of every 10 people it once had, more than a decade before anyone in Europe had ever even heard the word plague, more than a decade before a single ship carried it toward the Mediterranean. It was a dress rehearsal that nobody at the time recognized as one, a warning written in a language the rest of the world would not learn to read until it was already far too late. Imagine a modern province of similar size today, tens of millions of people, its capital, its farmland, its markets, its schools, emptied out within a handful of years, and almost nobody outside its own borders even hearing about it happening. That is roughly the scale of what unfolded in Hebei, centuries before newspapers, before global reporting, before the rest of the world had any way of knowing a catastrophe of this size had even taken place. Refugees who did survive fled south and west along the same roads the Mongol armies had built, carrying grief, rumor, and possibly something far more dangerous, into regions that had no idea what was coming toward them. But Hebei, as devastating as it was, burned mostly within the borders of one region, and it burned fast, in and out within a few brutal years. The next disaster on this list needed no disease at all to do its damage. It starved an entire continent slowly for 3 straight years running, one failed harvest after another, until hunger drove ordinary, decent people to something almost unspeakable. Number 5. The Great Famine. Picture endless rain falling on fields that will never ripen, grain rotting in the mud before anyone can bring it in, oxen too weak to pull a plow, and smoke rising from chimneys with nothing cooking above the fire. In the spring of 1315, catastrophic rains and unseasonable cold settled over northern Europe and simply refused to leave. Fields turned to standing water. Seed grain rotted before it could sprout, and what little did sprout drowned before harvest. Crops failed that year, and then failed again the following year, in 1316. The weather did not fully break until 1317, and full recovery for ordinary farming families took until 1322, a full 7 years after the first bad rains began to fall. Kings and city councils tried desperately to respond. Grain was bought at enormous cost from whatever distant region still had a surplus. Prices were fixed by royal order, and in some towns officials went from door to door searching for hidden stores of food. But there was simply not enough grain anywhere in reach to feed a starving continent. The famine stretched from Ireland and Britain, across France, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland. This was not one bad harvest in one unlucky region. It was the entire agricultural backbone of northern Europe failing all at once, with nowhere nearby to turn for grain, no neighboring region with surplus to sell or share, because everyone was drowning under the same relentless sky. Historians estimate that 10 to 25% of the population in some cities died during these years, and in the worst-hit towns the toll climbed higher still. Grain prices rose so far beyond reach that ordinary wages could no longer buy enough bread to survive on. Livestock, weakened by the same endless wet and cold, died by the thousands, taking away meat, milk, and plow power all at once, compounding a food shortage that had already turned into outright starvation. Chroniclers writing at the time recorded things that are difficult to read even now, centuries later. Parents, driven past the edge of endurance, were recorded as having eaten their own starving children. Freshly dug graves were said to have been robbed for food in the dead of night. The bodies of executed criminals were recorded as being cut down from the gallows and eaten by the desperate and the starving, acts that would have been unthinkable to the very same people only a few seasons earlier. Before things reached that point, ordinary families were already stripping their world bare just to stay alive. Chronicles describe people eating tree bark, boiling roots and weeds normally left for animals, slaughtering the very oxen and horses they needed for the next plowing season, trading away tools and even seed grain itself just to eat one more meal, which only guaranteed an even worse harvest the following year. These are not rumors invented long after the fact. They come from independent chronicles written across separate regions of northern Europe, by people describing what they witnessed or heard directly from their own communities, hundreds of miles apart, describing the same horror in their own words. The severity is confirmed by tree ring records showing just how catastrophic those failed harvests truly were. Cold rings and thin rings stacked one on top of another for years running. Scale this up in your mind for a moment. Northern Europe at the time held only a small fraction of the population it holds today, and yet a fifth or more of many cities died in under 3 years, from hunger alone, without a single soldier, without a single sword drawn. It remains one of the deadliest sustained famines ever recorded on the continent, and it happened not in some distant or poorly documented age, but in the well-recorded, well-governed heart of medieval Europe, among kingdoms with courts, taxes, and written law. 30 years later, the Black Death would arrive on a population across this same stretch of Europe that had never fully recovered its strength, still thin, still weakened, still carrying the scars of those 3 terrible years. The Great Famine did not just kill on its own terms. It left an entire generation smaller and weaker, unknowingly waiting for the next disaster to finish what hunger had already started. But the Great Famine, brutal as it was, came from causes anyone could see and name: endless rain, bitter cold, harvest after harvest failing in plain sight, season by season, with warning enough to at least understand what was happening. The next disaster on this list came from a mountain on the far side of the world, one nobody in Europe even knew existed, and it blotted out an entire summer without a single day of warning. Number 4. The Samalas eruption. Picture a summer that simply never warms up. Fields stay pale and stunted under gray skies, and farmers watch crops that should be ripening instead rot where they stand, while nobody in Europe has any idea why. The cause was not in Europe at all. It was on the other side of the planet, on the island of Lombok, in what is now Indonesia, where a volcano called Samalas tore itself apart in the year 1257. By the numbers scientists have since reconstructed, this was not just a large eruption. It ranks a 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the highest rating any eruption has reached in the past 7,000 years. The mountain hurled somewhere around 40 cubic kilometers of magma into the sky, give or take a few, and drove a column of ash and gas more than 43 kilometers straight up. To put that height in perspective, commercial airplanes today cruise at around 10 to 12 kilometers above the ground. The Samalas plume shot nearly 4 times higher than that, punching straight through the layer of the atmosphere where all of Earth's ordinary weather happens, and into the stratosphere above it, where high-altitude winds could carry its ash and sulfur horizontally around the entire planet within weeks. What made Samalas so dangerous was not the lava. Lava, however violent, stays local. It was the sulfur that made this eruption a planetary event. Samalas pumped roughly twice as much sulfur into the stratosphere as the far more famous Tambora eruption would, 558 years later, in 1815. Tambora is the eruption that gave the world the year without a summer, in 1816, when snow fell in New England in June and crops failed as far away as China. Samalas did the same thing first, and did it worse, and almost nobody alive today has ever heard its name. Tambora itself is not a small comparison to reach for. That later eruption was strong enough on its own to trigger famine across parts of Europe, crop failures in China, and one of the most infamous ruined summers in modern memory. Samalas pushed roughly twice as much sulfur into the sky as that, working from an island most people could not point to on a map, in a century with no telescopes, no ships fast enough to carry warnings, and no way for anyone in Europe to connect a bad harvest to a mountain they had never heard of. The sulfur climbed high enough to spread into a thin haze that wrapped around the entire globe, reflecting sunlight back into space and cooling the planet underneath it. By the following summer, 1258, Northern Europe was drowning in cold rain under skies that never quite cleared. Chroniclers of the time simply wrote down what they saw without understanding why it was happening: endless rain, ruined fields, grain that would not ripen no matter how long the growing season stretched on. Harvests failed across the continent. Grain prices climbed, then kept climbing, far outpacing what ordinary families could afford. Hunger followed, the way it always did whenever the sky stopped cooperating with the people depending on it. In London, archaeologists later uncovered mass graves from exactly this period, densely packed pits holding thousands of bodies, far more than any single outbreak of ordinary disease would explain. Radiocarbon dating placed the burials within a few years of 1258. Nobody can say for certain that every one of those people starved, or froze, or died from the diseases that follow hard on the heels of famine, all because of a volcano they never knew existed, on an island most of them could not have found on a map. But the timing lines up exactly, down to the year, and a city does not dig mass graves for no reason at all. Here is the part that should really unsettle you. For more than 150 years, scientists studying ice cores knew that something catastrophic had happened around 1257. The chemical signature was unmistakable, a massive spike of sulfur frozen into layer after layer of ancient ice, waiting patiently to be read. What nobody could do, for generation after generation of researchers, was say what had actually caused it. Other volcanoes were proposed as suspects over the decades. None of them matched. The eruption itself was, for over a century and a half, a crime scene with an obvious smoking gun and no identified culprit at all. It was not until 2013 that a team of researchers, led by the French volcanologist Frank Lavigne, finally matched the chemical fingerprint frozen in the ice to a specific, half-forgotten volcano on a remote Indonesian island most people had never heard of. A disaster large enough to darken skies and starve cities across an entire continent had been sitting unsolved, in plain sight of science, for a century and a half, hiding behind a name almost nobody had bothered to remember. But Samalas needed only one bad season to do its damage, and by the next summer the skies over Europe had mostly cleared again, the rain easing, the harvest slowly recovering. The next disaster on this list did not clear up after one summer. It swallowed the sun for a year and a half straight over 3 separate continents at once, and historians who study it now call it, without exaggeration, the worst year to be alive. Number 3. The year without sun. Picture looking up at midday and seeing something closer to dusk. A pale disk hanging where the sun should be, and a chill in the air that has no business being there in the middle of summer. That was 536. A dense, dry fog rolled in and settled over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, and it did not lift for 18 months. Writers living through it described a sun that gave light but almost no warmth, weak and faintly blue, as though it were shining through a veil that never quite burned off. Some described being able to look directly at the disk of the sun at midday without being blinded, something that should be physically impossible under a clear sky. The Roman official Cassiodorus, writing government letters at the time from what is now Italy, put it into words that still read strangely today. He described a sun that seemed to have lost its accustomed brightness, giving off only a feeble, moon-like glow, with almost no shadows falling even in the middle of the day. He was not writing poetry. He was a bureaucrat, filing an official report, trying to describe a sky that had simply stopped working the way skies were supposed to work. Try to imagine living through that. Not one gray afternoon, not one gloomy week, but month after month of a sky that never fully brightened, a sun that gave off light without ever really warming the ground beneath it. People woke up every morning to the same dim half-light, day after day, with no way of knowing when or if it would ever end. Summer temperatures across the affected regions dropped by somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees. That may sound modest, but it was enough to trigger what tree rings later revealed to be the coldest decade the Northern Hemisphere had experienced in over 2,300 years. In China, chroniclers recorded snow falling in the middle of summer and crops freezing on the stalk. In Ireland, monks writing in their annals recorded a failure of bread stretching from 536 all the way through 539. 4 straight years without a reliable harvest. Mesopotamian and Roman writers, thousands of kilometers apart, described the very same dimmed, colorless sun, in the very same season, without ever reading a word the other had written. For a long time, historians treated 536 as a strange but minor footnote, a few bad seasons buried among centuries of ordinary ones. Then, in 2018, the Harvard historian Michael McCormick, working with ice core data and tree ring records pulled from 3 separate continents, laid out the full scale of what had actually happened, reported in the pages of the science journal Science. His conclusion was about as close to blunt as historians get. He called 536 one of the worst years to be alive in the whole of recorded human history, if not the single worst year outright. Not a throwaway line for headlines, an actual scholarly argument, backed by physical evidence pulled from glaciers and dead trees on opposite sides of the planet. Scientists still argue over exactly what triggered it, whether it was one enormous volcanic eruption or a rapid sequence of them. Thousands of kilometers from the farms and cities that suffered through the darkness. What nobody argues about anymore is the scale of the suffering that followed, written down independently in the chronicles of societies that had no way of comparing notes with each other, on continents that barely knew the others existed. Try imagining the modern equivalent. A drop of just a degree or two in average temperature today would be enough to shorten growing seasons, stress crop yields, and trigger serious food shortages across entire regions. And that is with modern irrigation, fertilizer, and global shipping to fall back on. 6th century farmers had none of that. They had only whatever grew in the field in front of them, and in 536 across 3 continents at once, that field simply refused to ripen. Here is the detail that makes 536 different from almost everything else on this list. This was not one bad winter that people simply endured and moved past. An entire generation of children was born and grew toward adulthood, under skies that never fully brightened, in a world that had gone quietly, chemically colder around them, for a year and a half without a single real break. They had no name for what was happening to them, no volcano to blame, nothing to do but wait it out and keep planting, season after failed season. And the darkness was only the opening act. What came next would travel faster and kill more efficiently than almost anything the medieval world had yet seen. The sky had softened the empire up first, worn it down, starved it thin, and left its cities crowded with hungry, desperate people looking for grain wherever they could find it. The plague that followed did not need to work very hard. It only had to finish what the darkness had already started. Number 2. Justinian's plague. 5 years after the sun came back, the sickness arrived. 536 had already broken the world once, with darkness and failed harvests, weakening bodies across 3 continents. Weakened people, it turns out, make easy targets for what comes next. In 541, in the Egyptian port of Pelusium, a new horror stepped ashore. It moved along the grain ships, the same routes that fed Constantinople every season. Merchants who carried wheat to the capital carried something else in their holds: rats, fleas, and a bacterium that would soon have a name, Yersinia pestis. The fleas rode quietly in the fur of the rats, waiting for a warm body to bite. Nobody loading those ships had any idea what cargo they were truly carrying. Within months, the plague reached Constantinople itself, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. Victims broke out in the same swollen, blackened lumps that would haunt Europe centuries later. Fever, delirium, and collapse could follow within a matter of days. It began with a sudden high fever that would not break. Then came swollen lumps in the groin, the armpit, or the neck, hard enough to feel through the skin. Some victims turned black at the fingertips before they died, a sign doctors of the time had no name for. Whole households could die within the same week, sealed behind doors nobody was left to open. At its worst, chroniclers say the city buried 10,000 people in a single day. Markets emptied, ships stopped sailing, and grain shipments from Egypt slowed to a trickle. The same trade network that had carried wealth and food into the capital now carried only death. Trade between Constantinople and the rest of the Mediterranean nearly stopped overnight. Ships that once queued to unload grain now sat empty in the harbor, their crews too sick or too frightened to sail. The dead piled up faster than gravediggers could work, faster than priests could pray over them. Bodies were stacked in the open, packed into the towers of the city walls. At one point, According to the account of Procopius, the roofs of those towers had to be removed just to fit more corpses inside. Officials ordered massive pits dug just outside the city walls, and even those filled faster than new ones could be cut. Others were rowed out and dumped into the sea, because there was simply nowhere left on land. Even Emperor Justinian I did not escape it. He caught the sickness himself in the middle of the outbreak and, unlike so many of his subjects, survived. For weeks, the most powerful man in the empire lay in the same fevered, half-conscious state as any beggar dying in the streets outside his palace. His wife, Empress Theodora, held the palace together while he lay too weak to rule, and refused to let his generals plan for a world without him. The historian Procopius, who lived through it, called it a pestilence that nearly annihilated the whole human race. According to the traditional account, a third to half of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire died. That would mean tens of millions of lives erased in a matter of years. But history is not always as simple as one grieving eyewitness makes it sound. Since 2019, a wave of modern historians has challenged those numbers directly. They argue the classical death toll was maximalist, inflated by fear and by rhetoric. Archaeology, they say, gives only weak and uneven support for population collapse that large. Some historians now argue the true toll was far smaller, though the outbreak itself is not in doubt. Either way, entire regions of the empire go eerily quiet in the written record for years afterward. What is not in dispute is what the plague did to one man's ambitions. Emperor Justinian had spent years and fortunes trying to reunite the old Roman Empire. His armies were already stretched thin, fighting costly wars to reclaim Italy from foreign rule. According to the traditional version, the plague arrived at the worst possible moment and broke what the wars had not. Tax revenue collapsed because there was no one left alive to farm the land or pay it. Fields across the empire's richest provinces went unplanted that season because the hands that once worked them were gone. Soldiers who might have marched on Italy were busy burying their own families instead. The treasury emptied, the armies thinned, and the dream of one Rome again quietly died. The sickness did not vanish after 549 either. It returned in waves for the next 2 centuries, haunting the Mediterranean world until nearly 750. Centuries later, scientists would extract genetic material straight from the bones of its victims. The DNA confirmed something almost too strange to be a coincidence. The very same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, would return to the world 800 years afterward, under a far more famous name. Whatever the true death count of Justinian's outbreak turns out to be, the fear it left behind was total. And if a debate over exact numbers unsettles you, wait until you hear the next one, because the catastrophe waiting at the very top of this list needs no debate at all. Number 1. Black Death. By the year 1347, Europe had already survived earthquakes, floods, famine, and plague. Nothing had prepared it for what came next. The sickness began somewhere in Central Asia, carried west along trade routes and caravan roads. It reached the Genoese trading post of Kaffa, on the Crimean coast, during a siege. According to one chronicler of the time, the besieging army catapulted its own plague dead over the city walls. Some historians point to that moment as one of the earliest known uses of disease as a weapon. From there, merchant ships carried it across the Black Sea toward home. In October of 1347, a handful of Genoese galleys docked in Sicily. Most of the sailors aboard were already dead or dying. Within days, the disease had reached the harbor town of Messina. Within weeks, it was climbing into mainland Italy, then France, then the rest of the continent. By the spring of 1348, it had reached Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. By that summer, it was burning through Paris and pressing toward the English coast. Within a year, it had crossed into England, then pushed on into Germany and Scandinavia. No kingdom, no city, No coastline seemed to be far enough away to stay safe. Victims developed swollen, blackened lumps in the neck, the armpits, and the groin. Fever came fast, then delirium, then death, often within days of the first symptom. Some towns lost entire households overnight, with no one left to bury the bodies. Grave pits were dug outside city walls and filled faster than they could be closed. Contemporaries did not call it the Black Death. That name came centuries later. At the time, people simply called it the Great Mortality or the Great Pestilence. Physicians of the age had no idea what a bacterium even was. Most blamed bad air or the alignment of the planets and could offer little beyond prayer. Many believed it was the literal end of the world, a judgment from above. In some cities, groups of flagellants marched from town to town, beating themselves in public hoping penance might turn the sickness away. In the worst chapters of this story, terrified communities turned on their Jewish neighbors, blaming them for poisoning wells and driving them from cities across the continent. Jewish communities suffered from the disease exactly like everyone else. The accusations were baseless cruelty layered on top of a genuine catastrophe. Priests, doctors, and gravediggers died at the same rate as everyone else. In the years that followed, artists began painting skeletons leading people from every rank of society toward the grave. Peasant, merchant, bishop, and king marched together in the same procession, a reminder that death had spared no one. Historian Ole Benedicto of the University of Oslo spent decades studying the true toll. His research suggests up to 60% of Europe's entire population died. With roughly 80 million people living on the continent at the time, that is staggering. It points to something close to 50 million deaths in Europe alone. More conservative historians put the figure lower, between 30 and 50%. Even by the cautious estimate, 1 in 3 Europeans did not survive. Worldwide, across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, the toll climbs even higher. Some historians estimate 75 to 200 million deaths across the known world. Centuries later, scientists tested skeletons pulled from a mass grave in London, at a site called East Smithfield. The bones carried genetic traces of Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium behind Justinian's plague 800 years earlier. Any lingering doubt about the true cause of the Black Death was settled by that discovery. By the time the worst wave passed, in 1351, the map of Europe had changed. Entire villages stood empty, fields lay unplanted, and manors sat without hands to work them. The people who did survive suddenly held power they never had before. With so few laborers left alive, the ones remaining could demand real wages. Landlords who once controlled every peasant's life now had to bargain or lose their harvest. Within a generation, revolts broke out across England, France, and beyond, demanding fairer treatment. Slowly, the old system of serfdom that had bound peasants to the land began to crack. A disease that killed on an almost unimaginable scale also broke feudal Europe apart. It cleared the ground without meaning to, for everything that came after, including the Renaissance. Up to 6 in 10 Europeans were gone within 4 years. By share of population, nothing in recorded history has ever matched it. 9 catastrophes on this list bent the medieval world, cracked it, tested it to its limits. Every earthquake, flood, eruption, famine, and plague on this list had already shown how much loss a civilization could absorb. This one very nearly broke it for good. And somehow, out of that much death, a new world eventually grew. 10 catastrophes, one pattern. Every single time, from a shaken city in Syria to a drowned coastline in the North Sea, civilization stood at the edge and looked over. A city shaken, then burned in the same terrible night. A coastline drowned, an entire town erased before morning. A land frozen under ash it never saw coming. A city shattered by an earthquake nobody expected in a place thought safe. A province sickened almost past recognition. A people starved down to bone, driven to the unthinkable. A sky darkened by a mountain on the far side of the world. A sun dimmed for 18 months, while a generation grew up in the gloom. A dream buried, along with an emperor's hope of one Rome again. And a continent brought to its knees, not quite ended, but never the same again. 10 different disasters, one same lesson: medieval civilization was far more fragile than we remember, and far tougher than it had any right to be. Every time it staggered, it broke something essential, and it kept going anyway, over and over, until it finally held. Most people scroll past videos like this one and forget every name within an hour. You made it all the way to #1, so you are clearly not most people. Which of these 10 disasters do you think came closest to actually ending civilization? Drop your pick in the comments and be ready to defend it, because plenty of people will disagree with you. If stories like these, the ones history almost erased, are the ones you actually want to remember, there is a lot more of this world still waiting.